Are we entering a period of stagflation for the second time in the 2020s? What happened the last time we had prolonged stagflation in Britain? Why is the 70s increasingly seen as a massive turning point in our economy and politics? To answer all these questions and more, I spoke with Andy Beckett, journalist at The Guardian and author of the book When the Lights Went Out: What Really Happened in the 70s. I hope you enjoy. Andy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why did you decide to write a book about the 70s?
Well, I'm in my 50s, and when I first kind of became politically conscious, which was kind of in the 80s, early 90s, the 70s was always talked about as this kind of terrible period in Britain, you know, the worst ever period in British sort of modern history, almost like a forbidden period. And arguments that you'd have at university about politics, people would often say, well, you don't want to go back to the 70s. That was always like the winning argument. So after a bit of that, I thought, well, hang on, how bad was it really? How solid is this kind of picture that we've been brought up on of sort of, you know, economic decline and sort of social strife and sort of political chaos? You know, how true is that really? If you like, the kind of Thatcher view of that period was still very dominant certainly in the second half of the 80s, early 90s. And I was then working in journalism, sort of early 90s, late 90s, and I just started writing books, and I thought, this is like the topic. It's like the thing. Let's go back to this period, and let's try and tell the story of it reasonably chronologically so that you don't have everything dominated by hindsight. Because I think a lot of how the 70s is seen is like, well, it ended badly, therefore it was all bad. And obviously that's a very simplistic way of looking at any historical period.
Right. It's interesting to see how the views of the 70s might be changing. So a recent poll said that 60% of people would prefer to be born in 1975 than today. If those respondents were to go back to 1975, what would be the mood of the country they found themselves in, and how would it compare to today?
I think in some ways it would seem quite familiar that in the mid-70s, Britain's in a period of kind of great uncertainty. There's a lot of talk about national decline. There's kind of governments under siege, like the Starmer government now. So some things would be quite familiar, but other things would be startlingly different. Like, for example, the level of poverty in the mid-70s compared to now would seem extremely low. The number of people living in council housing would seem very high. The amount of consumer goods that were available would seem a bit scanty compared to now. So the country would seem less dominated by commerce, much more equal. I mean, the 1976, I think, a lot of social scientists say, is the period at which Britain was most equal as it's ever been. So it's a sort of strange world that in some ways would seem quite depressing because it just that things would be slower, there'd be less kind of colour, but in other ways, depending on your politics, possibly quite inspiring. I mean, in the 70s, when unemployment reached 1 million, that was seen as like a terrible crisis. And now, when unemployment is 1 million, politicians are absolutely delighted. You think that's an incredibly low figure. So I think someone going back would see it in some ways as kind of depressing, and in other ways like, wow, this is a whole other future we could have had, a much more equal country, a country much more like a kind of Scandinavian country or like France or Germany now, and much less like a sort of Americanized Britain that we gradually kind of got used to since then.
There were some ups and downs in the 70s. One of those downs was the 3-day week of 1974. How did that happen?
So the 3-day week happened when the Conservatives were in power. So Edward Heath was the Prime Minister, and he'd had this kind of economic boom in the early 70s based on very sort of reckless sort of expansionary economic policies. And that boom had kind of gone bust. And then in 1973, there was a war between Israel and neighbouring Arab countries. And as part of that war, to put pressure on Western countries that were supporting Israel, the Arab countries started to reduce or boycott oil sales altogether to Western countries like Britain. So you had a kind of a British economy in recession. You had the price of oil going up by a factor of about 500% quite quickly. And you also had the final ingredient. In 1974, the miners went on strike, and the National Union of Mine Workers was then very powerful. They went on strike partly because they had maximum leverage when there was already a crisis about energy. So the Heath government decided we need to get through the winter, and the only way we can get through the winter is by reducing energy consumption. And we're going to do that in a kind of Second World War type way, where we basically ration energy, electricity, 3 days a week on different, very complex schedules to different kinds of businesses. And that went on for a couple of months, January, February, into March 1974. So a kind of startling, sort of almost like wartime vibe essentially was created. Some people absolutely loved the 3 day week because lots of people only worked 3 days a week. And for a lot of people, that was fantastic. There were lots of articles in the tabloids about how people were having much more exploratory sex lives during the 3 day week because they were home a lot more. But other people found it incredibly depressing, difficult. So it's a kind of amazing moment of crisis. And I think one of the things about the 70s that's fascinating is that it's seen as a decade where Labour failed in government. And I bet if you ask people in the street now, when did the 3 day week happen? Who was in power? A lot of people would probably say Labour, and actually it happened under the Conservatives. So if you like, the beginning of the really rocky period in the 70s is under the Conservatives, and then it then continues under Labour, which in a way is similar to the sort of dynamic we're in now, where Starmer is struggling, but the roots of a lot of what he's struggling with are in a period of Conservative rule.
And I guess similarly to Keir Starmer's government, Labour came in shortly afterwards promising a big change in how the government functions. What were they promising? So
after Heath left office, I mean, there were two elections in 1974, because the first election, there was essentially a hung parliament. And so they then had another election a few months later. So again, it's quite similar to sort of things that have happened more recently, like in 2010 with the hung parliament then. So the Conservatives lost power, even though they actually got more votes than Labour. Harold Wilson came into power, and Harold Wilson had been Prime Minister before, but by this point, he was getting a bit old. His health was a bit ropey, and he came into power on a very radical manifesto in 1974 that said there was going to be, I'm slightly paraphrasing here, it's an irreversible shift in power and wealth to working people. So the manifesto sounded very radical, but Wilson was a kind of slightly tired but very wily, rather pragmatic prime minister. So there was immediately this tension. People on the left of the Labour Party, like Tony Benn, thought the country was going to be transformed, whereas Wilson almost wanted to sort of just steady the ship. And a little bit like Starmer was sort of saying, I'll come in after the Tories and I'll just be the grown-up and I'll kind of calm things down. So in some ways, his predicament was similar to Starmer's. I think one way in which they're different is that Wilson, as I've said, had already been Prime Minister, been a politician for a long time, and was, flawed but very expert politician, very good communicator. So he was crisis managing exactly like Starmer is now, but Wilson had the advantage. He didn't have a big majority, but Wilson had a command of the media and command of kind of parliamentary procedure. So he was able to kind of hang on in this very difficult period for a couple of years, crisis managing, and also holding together an incredibly sort of disputatious, sort of diverse cabinet. So there were people in Wilson's cabinet who were very left-wing, and there were people who were almost conservatives, and they were in the same cabinet. And again, Starmer hasn't had the confidence to have left-wingers of that sort in his cabinet, whereas Wilson did, and sort of held them all in balance and played them off against each other. So again, one of the paradoxes of the time is Britain in the mid-70s is seen as kind of out of control, and in some ways it was. But actually, particularly Wilson and then his successor, Callaghan, both Labour prime ministers, were incredibly skilled at kind of crisis management and arguably much better than Starmer's proving to be now.
And one thing they do differently is their relationship with the unions.
Yeah.
And they have this thing called the social contract. Yeah. So what is that?
So we have to think back to this period in the mid-70s. This is kind of quite close to the peak of kind of union power in Britain. So the number of people who are actually in unions, it's about 50% of the workforce, maybe slightly more. Now we're down to about 20%. So unions had much bigger memberships. What unions could do in terms of striking was much less constrained by law than it is now. So there'd been big strikes already in the early 70s under Heath. So the unions were very powerful. And what Wilson decided to do was to almost try and govern the country to some extent in collaboration with the unions. And the unions would agree to kind of moderate their pay demands. In return, the government would do certain things around benefits and housing that the unions liked. So it was a kind of experiment. For Britain, it was an experiment in sort of almost a corporatist kind of government where you try and get unions and politicians to work together. Now, again, we'll get into this, but it's interesting that the social contract is seen by conventional historians and certainly by conservative politicians as being this sort of outrageous, bizarre experiment. That kind of close collaboration between unions and government is completely normal in most of continental Europe and has been since at least the Second World War. So one of the ways in which Britain is unusual in the mid-70s is things that abroad are seen as pretty normal in Britain are seen as a kind of outrageous change to the status quo. And the social contract, worked reasonably well for 4 or 5 years. And then it basically fell apart at the end of the 70s in the winter of discontent when a lot of unions went on strike because essentially they'd been accepting below inflation pay rises for 4 or 5 years and pressure had built up. But for 4 or 5 years, in lots of ways, it worked fairly well. And very powerful union leaders like Jack Jones, who I interviewed when he was in his 90s, who was still a complete piece of work even in his 90s, these very kind of powerful working class men going to see the Prime Minister regularly. Again, I think one of the ways in which the 70s is seen as transgressive is the idea that of people who are obviously very working class having a huge amount of power. That is seen by a lot of people in Britain at the time and since as being a kind of upsetting of the natural order, if you like. Whereas for other people, it's great. If you're Jack Jones or you're someone in his union, you think it's as it should be. His union has millions of members. And some union leaders in the social contract used it to kind of bully the government, but other union leaders were really keen it didn't fall apart and actually were quite keen to sort of be in with the government and, if you like, moderate their demands. So there's a range of kind of responses to it.
How was the thinking on the right changing at this time?
So, as we've touched on, Edward Heath, who was quite a centrist Conservative leader, had lost power in 74, but he remained as Conservative leader. And then Margaret Thatcher mounted a kind of surprise attack on him for the Conservative leadership the following year in 1975. And through kind of quite clever manoeuvring, like pretending that she had no chance and therefore getting various MPs to vote for her, almost as a protest vote, she won the leadership. And Margaret Thatcher was temperamentally very, very different from Heath, confrontational, very articulate, from a wealthier background than Heath, but still from a relatively sort of modest background. And Thatcher was already quite interested in free market thinking, which had been developing, particularly in Austria and in America from the 40s onwards, but particularly in the 60s and the 70s. So if you like, you had a new Thatcher, you had a new kind of Conservative leader coming in who was open to ideas, and the new right-wing think tanks like the Institute of Economic Affairs, which were founded earlier in the mid-70s, mounted a big push to kind of disseminate their ideas. So the IEA would hold all these lunches and they would invite politicians and give them lots of wine and food and sort of persuade them that free market ideas were going to rescue the British economy. And there was a really kind of interesting sort of ideological counteroffensive going on in the early 70s during the Heath government. And then when Heath fell, the people on the right could say, look, Heath's a centrist, that didn't work. So the radical thing is the way to go. So at this point in the mid-70s, you've got the beginning of the economic ideas have been around for a while, but they're beginning to get real political purchase in the right-wing press, in papers like The Times, particularly in The Economist, in these think tanks, amongst politicians. Even some Labour politicians are quite interested in some of these ideas. Dennis Healey, who became the Chancellor for Labour in the mid-70s, although by no means a sort of a Tory in any way, was quite interested in some of the new right-wing economic ideas. So there's an interesting sort of counter-revolution bubbling up by this point. And of course, the fact the economy in Britain is struggling in the mid-70s, people on the radical right who wanted a kind of free market economy could say, look, the existing economy isn't working. So they were kind of pushing an open door.
There are also some social changes going on. So one of the conventional wisdoms of the 70s is that there was a backlash against the permissive society of the 60s and the liberal social change which had happened. So to what extent is that true?
I think that's true to some extent. I mean, you get campaigners like Mary Whitehouse, who was a kind of anti-pornography campaigner, sort of anti-obscenity campaigner who became very powerful in the mid-70s. So there was a kind of pushback, particularly in the right-wing press, which obviously had much, bigger circulations then than it has now. There will be a lot written about how the 60s are kind of ruined the country. So there was a kind of pushback then. But one of the things about the 70s that's fascinating is there's a reaction against the 60s, but at the same time, there's a sort of intensification of the 60s happening at the same time. So for a lot of people who are not in the big cities, the 70s is when the 60s really happens. And to give a personal example, I was growing up then in Hertfordshire, And I remember we was living in suburbia. My dad was a soldier, and we were living in a sort of semi. And behind us, there was this big sort of slightly derelict sort of garden centre, and it had been turned into an inverted commas arts centre. And I remember one of my childhood memories is age sort of 4 or 5, all these men with beards and kind of long hair going in and out all the time, often with their shirts off or whatever. You know, there were kind of hippie events were happening in suburban Hertfordshire in the mid-70s. And so things like squatting, environmentalism, feminism, gay rights, all these movements in Britain either really got going in the 70s or grew much bigger. So that's one of the things that makes the period turbulent, that if you like, there's a kind of push to transform the country simultaneously in a conservative direction and in a more liberal direction. And those different forces are kind of fighting it out, if you like. So, yeah, I'm always cautious about any conventional wisdom about the 70s, but I think particularly this idea it's a kind of more conservative period, it's important to push back against, because if you look at how people are actually living, a lot of 60s stuff in the 60s is like a few thousand of the kind of cooler people in London or Manchester or Liverpool, whereas in the 70s it's a much bigger subculture. The counterculture is much, much bigger in the 70s than it was in the 60s.
So potentially more polarization.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely going on, and that's partly where the kind of conflict in the 70s comes from. And we've touched on trade unions already. You know, trade unions for a lot of the post-war period, although Labour supporting, were kind of socially quite conservative, whereas by the mid-70s, trade unions have a lot more women involved. They're beginning to have a lot more non-white members. They're becoming much more politically radical. So unions themselves became more radical in the 70s, which is partly where the friction around unions comes from.
So moving to politics today a little bit. So some people will say that we've experienced peak woke, and there's a kind of backlash against woke politics going on. Was there a similar feeling at the time?
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel. I mean, for example, Jim Callaghan, who I've mentioned, who became the Labour Prime Minister in 1976, he was quite a social conservative. His dad had been in the Merchant Navy. Jim Callaghan was obsessed by like where the Royal Navy had all its ships around the world and always wanted to look at maps of where they were. And Jim Callaghan on education was very conservative, and he made quite a famous speech in the late 70s basically saying sort of liberal education, which had become a big thing post-war, had been a mistake. So before Thatcher became Prime Minister, Callaghan was already saying that liberal education had been an error. So there was definitely some of that going on. But I think in a way similar to now, that people will say wokeness is over, but I think in all kinds of ways, concepts that wokeness contains are now kind of embedded in everyday life. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that Reform UK are terribly proud of the fact that they have quite a multiracial kind of front of house team now, if you like. And they'll never say diversity is good, but essentially that's part of what they're selling. They're saying we're not just traditional, right-wing party. Look at our, look at how diverse we are. So I think, if you read a paper like The Telegraph, it always fascinates me that there'll be columnists who are furious about wokeness, and then you look to the consumer pages and it's like, oh, okay, it's a slightly different thing. Here's a feature about, same-sex marriage or whatever. And so clearly the Telegraph is absorbing parts of wokeness while rejecting others. And I think that complex dynamic was also happening in the 70s. Things are becoming embedded and rejected at the same time.
That's really interesting. Another change that was happening was a movement away from this thing called the post-war consensus.
Yeah.
And a different kind of view of economics was emerging. So what was going on?
I mean, I'm going to talk in very broad terms because I'm not an economist, but essentially post-war, a lot of the British economy was being run on kind of Keynesian lines. So the idea was that, particularly during recessions, the state should spend more and invest more to kind of boost demand in the economy. And that the role of the state was, if you like, to make capitalism function more smoothly, more fairly, and to sort of regulate it to some degree. And lots of people, including me, would argue that that worked reasonably well in the sort of 40s, 50s, 60s. But by the 70s, in some ways, that system wasn't working so well. Things like the oil crisis, which we touched on, had sort of disrupted the global economy. Growth was generally slower. The unions, who are part of this kind of Keynesian model because they were, if you like, helping the government to sort of regulate growth, were becoming more recalcitrant. So if you thought Keynesianism was a kind of dead end, which free marketeers generally did, then by the mid-70s you could say either this was a mistake all along, or it's kind of run its course, if you like. And there's a kind of counter-revolution against Keynesianism building in the same universities and think tanks that we've talked about that are promoting the free market. And even people on the left who would have been Keynesians earlier, by the mid-70s are beginning to have doubts. They're beginning to think, is this really going to work? Maynard Keynes was a brilliant, brilliant man, but, he died in the 40s, and a lot of his work is in the 20s. So by 1976, say, that's half a century ago. So in a way, it didn't seem unreasonable to say this form of economic thinking is a bit out of date. We're in a more complex world now. Other aspects of the post-war consensus were the Conservatives and Labour being relatively close in terms of policy. So Labour built lots of council houses, and when the Conservatives came into power, they built lots of council houses. And that was a big consensus around housing. Whereas, we may touch on this, Margaret Thatcher didn't build lots of council houses. She sold off lots of council houses. So you had Thatcher, who had there was a big gap ideologically between Margaret Thatcher and Wilson and Callaghan, whereas Heath and Wilson, say, would have agreed on quite a few things. So you get a kind of economic and a sort of political fracturing, if you like.
So at this time, the UK gets loans from the IMF, and the IMF actually has an impact on politics and economics. So how does that happen?
So, this is one of the most notorious episodes of the 1970s. In 1976, the IMF had to, in inverted commas, bail out Britain. And the IMF had actually given Britain loans at various points post-war, because Britain had recurring problems with its trade deficit and with the strength of its currency. And without getting too deep into the technicalities, during 1976, there was a kind of crisis in the value of sterling. And the Bank of England tried to support the currency and wasn't able to. The markets were not convinced that it was a currency worth defending. And the government, which was by this point was Jim Callaghan's government, basically went to the IMF and said, we need you to come and can bail us out. And the Chancellor then was Dennis Healey, who I've already mentioned, who was quite a new Chancellor, who was a very clever guy, but new. And in the Treasury particularly, civil servants were saying to him, the pound is in free fall, we need a bailout. And one thing that's fascinating, which Healey talked to me about when I interviewed him for the book, is that the IMF came to London. And it was a lot of theatre. These guys in raincoats kind of came, generally Americans came, they stayed in this posh hotel in Mayfair. Some of the people involved in the IMF delegation had themselves been involved in a bailout of New York City, which had almost gone bankrupt the previous year. So these were kind of quite hard-nosed people saying essentially home truths for liberals. Your sums don't add up. We're going to come and sort you out. But in return, we're going to lend you money, but you're going to have to make some big spending cuts. So they were here. There were secret meetings. There were, tabloid photographers taking pictures of them, sort of traveling around London, and it was seen as very humiliating. People thought the IMF is the kind of organization you call in if you're a struggling African country. What about a rich kind of post-imperial country? It's a humiliation. But one thing that's fascinating is that Healey discovered subsequently, and I think this is correct, that the actual forecasts made by the Treasury were too pessimistic about the public finances. And it's quite debatable now as to whether that loan was actually needed. And I interviewed someone for the book who was very senior in the Treasury, who didn't quite admit this, but pretty much did, that essentially they slightly fiddled the figures because they wanted the government to change its policies. And this was known notoriously as a Treasury bounce. So it's a fascinating episode in British history because it's conventionally seen as this national humiliation, and it was humiliating. But to some extent, I'd argue it was about the markets and about bits of Whitehall almost deciding, not in a conspiracy, but deciding that we're going to basically bully the government into, a different form of kind of spending strategy. And Callaghan government brought in big public spending cuts in the late 70s, and the IMF was happy. The British economy kind of recovered, the pound strengthened. But one of the reasons why, at the end of the 70s, the unions rebelled against the government and why Labour lost the election in 79 was because people on the left didn't like the spending cuts. So Healey, who remained Chancellor, was quite bitter, in retirement, because he was like, I was bounced into this, it wasn't necessary, it might have even lost us the election. So it's a really interesting kind of rich episode. And the way it's remembered as a very particular thing is important, because the IMF, as I say, bailed out Britain at various points in the 40s and in the 60s, but it's the 76 bailout that's remembered by everybody. And it tells you a lot about how symbolism in politics and economics really matters. And sometimes the substance is more complex, but it's a symbol. There was one point where Healy was going to go to a big meeting of an international group. I think it was in Manila, and he had to turn back from the airport because the pound was falling so much. And you can just imagine how that looks on telly. Like, here's the Chancellor literally coming out of the airport terminal with his briefcase going back to the Treasury. So moments like that were kind of catastrophic for the reputation of the government. And yeah, some people on the left or even in the centre would say it wasn't actually necessary, that essentially the government was kind of manipulated, if you like. And because Healy wasn't that streetwise at that point as a new Chancellor, he was maybe pushed around more than he should have been.
Was this also part of a general theme of American influence in Britain, socially, for example?
Yeah, I mean, something that's hard to imagine now, but until the mid-70s, traveling to America from Britain was really expensive. And so only really wealthy people did it. And then a guy called Freddie Laker, who was a pioneer of kind of budget travel, brought in these cheap transatlantic airfares in the mid-70s. So suddenly going to America, certainly for kind of middle-class people, even some working-class people, became affordable. So American culture had obviously been very important in Britain since at least the 1930s. George Orwell used to complain about it in the 30s. But by the 70s, things like McDonald's started in Britain in the 70s. You could go to America easily. A lot of American TV shows were on. So there is a kind of Americanization of Britain that kind of accelerates in that period. And I think one of the things about the 70s that's fascinating is that the consumerism of Britain then, by the standards of now, would probably seem quite tame, but at the time was very, very powerful. And if you ever watch TV shows from the 70s or movies set in the 70s, people's homes are actually full of like 70s stuff. And depending on your taste, it either looks very embarrassing or really quite cool. But if you did the same shows in the 60s, people wouldn't have had all those gadgets because they had less spending power. Ordinary people in the 70s in Britain had a lot more money than they'd had before because they were getting big pay settlements and poverty was low, unemployment was low. So Americanization was partly a sort of symptom, if you like, of kind of consumer confidence, of people just having spending power. And I think, again, this is a really important point about the 70s, that this idea that the 70s was like an awful time. For certain groups, maybe slightly more elite groups, it was really awful. If you owned a lot of shares and the stock market was collapsing, it was terrifying. But if you're in a trade union and you were getting 20% pay rises and you were able to buy your own home for the first time, and maybe your kids were going to university for the first time, and your house had like a new hi-fi, and you had a massive new TV, and you maybe went to New York for Christmas, it seemed like quite a good time. And accounts of the 70s written by, if you like, working class people are often, wow, we were having a good time. Whereas accounts written, if you like, from the top of society are often like, what a terrifying, depressing time. And I think a lot of the argument about what the 70s means is to a degree a class argument. You had a very different experience depending on where you were on the kind of social economic scale.
And part of this change, I guess, was also there was a collapse in confidence in the ability of the government to do things in the economy. That was definitely exploited later by Margaret Thatcher, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. That, as we've touched on, there's a change of government in 1974. Wilson inherited a very troubled economy post-oil crisis. He had a new chancellor, Healy, who was bright but didn't really know what he was doing. As Healy admitted to me, initially he was learning on the job in the middle of a massive crisis, which is not ideal. And there's a period, particularly 1975, is a very, very damaging year because all kinds of very grown-up publications like The Economist or The Wall Street Journal are running editorials. Wall Street Journal ran a famous editorial in 75 saying goodbye Great Britain, and it's just this idea that this country has basically blown it. It's now going to be in permanent, maybe accelerating decline. It was a very common view amongst people in the City of London or in the business press that Britain was finished, or certainly in a frightening decline. And although I'd argue that as a very simplistic picture, if people say that enough, and these are kind of grown-up people who know the economy, then that becomes powerful. And the FTSE 100 performs very badly in these middle years in the 70s. There's quite a bad recession in the mid-70s. It doesn't last that long, but 18 months. And also, it's quite a tough crisis period for wealthier people because in the mid-70s, house prices are quite low. People are seeing their shares lose value. I'd argue it's very different from the kind of economic turbulence that we've experienced here in recent years, where arguably very wealthy people have been quite insulated and generally poorer people have suffered. Whereas in the 70s, if you were a working class person in full-time employment, you were doing quite nicely. But the person who maybe owned the shares in your company might be struggling. And so there's a very powerful narrative that Britain was kind of in free fall then. Mm-hmm. And stepping back, you can think this is a kind of hysteria. There's not the evidence. Even the very bad mid-70s recession, the GDP goes down by, 1.5% or a couple of percent. It's not a huge amount. But at the time, it did seem frightening to a certain kind of person. And there's also a sense, as you've suggested, that people thought government's not in control. Healy coming back from the airport with his briefcase, having to change his schedule because the pound's falling. That's literally an example of government not in control. So that loss of confidence in the ability of the government to control things is probably terminal. And one of the things that's fascinating is that between 76, the IMF bailout, and the election in 79, in lots of ways, the economy kind of strengthens again. The pound does quite well, growth returns, inflation, which in the mid-70s, we haven't touched on this yet, hits 25%. By the end of the 70s, it's sort of 8%, which is still high, but it's gone down a lot. So some people would say that Labour had already kind of turned things around to a significant degree by the end of the 70s, but to voters who are not following this necessarily that closely, they remember the crisis. And in a way, the government could never quite recover from the loss of confidence in the mid-70s. One fascinating fact about the election in 1979 is that Labour actually got more votes in that election than they did in the 74 elections. So it's not true that Labour's support collapsed. But what happened in 79 was a lot of people who would have voted for other parties, particularly the Liberals, decided that the Conservatives were going to save the country. So it's not like there's a collapse in faith in Labour. It's more that people kind of agglomerate around Thatcher as a saviour. And that's a very powerful force.
It is. And you could say that there's a similar narrative of decline today. So I'm interested in your view of what a narrative of decline does to politics and what it does to the leading party as well.
I think you're right. I think it's very similar. I think, the word decline, particularly if you read right-wing papers, but equally in The Guardian or the FT, is in, if you read a column, it's always in there somewhere. It's the idea of the country's in decline, and again, rather like the 70s, maybe an accelerating decline. That's absolutely in the air now. And I think that's incredibly corrosive for a government, because it means that everything that looks like bad news kind of gets blamed on the government. So in the 70s, lots of things that were difficult, like the oil crisis, were really nothing to do with what Heath had got wrong or what Wilson had got wrong. They were external factors, but they were blamed, if you like, for the price of petrol going up. And it's very similar now that all kinds of craziness around Trump that creates problems in the British economy, Starmer to some degree gets the blame for that, even though it's completely outside his control or largely outside his control. But I think once the idea of decline is kind of established in the discourse, it's really difficult for a government to push back against, because on some fundamental level, Britain has been in decline for at least 100, 150 years, because obviously it used to be this imperial power that controlled massive swathes of the world. So if you once you start thinking about the country in declinist terms, like we're not as important, great, whatever your word is, we used to be, you can always find stuff that fits that narrative. And there are other periods in British history, I'd say during the Blair government, where it's not like at the end of the Blair government, Britain was any more powerful than it had been at the beginning. But because the economy was growing, the idea that Britain was no longer ruling the world and was just a wealthy European country, for a lot of voters, that was fine. People were quite content with that. So once there's a kind of declinist mentality in the press or amongst voters, the glass is perpetually kind of half empty, if you like, in their mind. Whereas when voters are feeling more positive, then people are like, I remember my dad, who was, a sort of small C conservative, born in India, sort of child of the empire. He was quite happy with Britain not being a great imperial power anymore, but at points of crisis, people are suddenly like, look, everything is bad, everything's going downhill, and people see everything in that kind of dark way. And I think that's definitely the case now, that almost everything that happens in Britain, even if it's nothing to do with the government, is seen as part of this kind of dynamic of decline. And the governments of the 70s got caught up in a similar kind of glass half empty atmosphere.
And I guess when decline is on everyone's minds, then a political party saying that they'll take us back to when we were better is likely to do well.
Yeah. Although it's interesting that with Thatcherism, it was very socially conservative, and Thatcher was a real social conservative, and that was part of her appeal. So there was a kind of anti-60s, anti-permissiveness kind of aspect to her appeal. But I think her appeal on the economy, which I think in some ways was more important, it wasn't so much backward looking. It was almost like we're going to create a new economy. So I think she wasn't really saying we're going to be like the economy of the 50s or the 60s. It was like that was all fundamentally didn't work and we have to look forward. So I think Thatcherism is a fascinating mixture of sort of retro and forward looking, and they're both kind of in the mix there.
I guess you could say the same about reform now. On economics, they're not necessarily saying we're going back.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose what they're saying on economics is still quite unformed, isn't it? That they seem to sort of oscillate between saying we might sort of, be more statist and sort of populist and nationalise things, and then they're saying we're going to deregulate like you've never seen, and they're trying to ride both horses at once, I think. I think there's some similarities with reform, but I think a difference is, and I would say this is maybe some of the shallowness of what reform are representing, is that Thatcherism, although it's not my politics or my economics, was based on decades and decades of really quite deep thinking that have been going on since at least the 40s about modernity and how the economy might be transformed. And a lot of very smart people in think tanks and so on, really thinking. And I would say the problem for reform, and I think for a lot of populists on the right generally, the Trump administration is having the same problem, is their economic policies are not really necessarily based on a serious consideration of like how the world is. They're based on a mixture of sort of nostalgia, some sort of nicking ideas off the left. It's quite a sort of thin brew, I would say, and so that's why economically, it seems like there aren't many examples around the world of populist right-wingers in power really being economically successful, so far at least. And I'd say that's because what they're drawing on is a bit thin. Whereas I think Thatcher, Reagan and America were drawing on, a really powerful sort of body of knowledge, a sort of intellectual sort of ecosystem that they could draw on. And, very smart people they could hire. Something I thought about a lot when Dominic Cummings was very prominent in Boris Johnson's government was that, Dominic Cummings is like a clever guy, unusual thinker. But in the Thatcher government, he would have been a relatively junior person because there would have been dozens of people like him who were sort of iconoclasts to bring in. Whereas under Johnson, Cummings was almost the only one. So he got a huge amount of power. That was a sign of weakness, if you like, that Cummings became so powerful.
At that time, you say that there was a bit of a competition between the Labour Party and the Conservatives about being tough on immigration.
Yeah. I mean, Britain had had a relatively liberal kind of immigration policy in the sort of 50s and 60s, and then it started to restrict immigration more. If you like, the last gasp of the kind of really generous immigration policy was in the early 70s. Idi Amin, who was a kind of dictatorial leader of Uganda, expelled a lot of Asian Ugandans for all kinds of complex reasons. And Edward Heath said basically they can come to Britain. And a lot of those people and their descendants have been, I don't think this is just me being a liberal, transformational for the British economy. All kinds of interesting politicians and business leaders and so on come from that community. That was in the early 70s. And then particularly under Callaghan, who was quite a social conservative, Labour, although they legislated for kind of against racism and for equal rights, they restricted immigration in various ways. And in the mid-70s, the National Front, which was a kind of far-right party, quite thuggish far-right party, was very active in street politics, particularly in places like East London. They would mount marches, they would smash shop windows, they would intimidate Asian residents. And the National Front in the elections in 1974, in those very turbulent elections, did quite well. They got a few percent of the vote. In parts of London, they got 10, 15% of the vote. So a bit like now, there was an idea that immigration was a kind of toxic issue, potentially. And something Margaret Thatcher did in 1978, which was, I would say nasty but very effective, was she made a speech in 1978 where she said that some people in Britain were afraid that their culture was being swamped. That was the word she used, by foreign culture. And essentially what Margaret Thatcher was doing was she was appealing to National Front voters to vote Conservative. Now, if you're a Conservative, you might say she sort of calmed the issue down because obviously her policies were not racist in the way that the National Fronts would have been. But she brought some of their voters on board. So yeah, it's a period where, if you can look at it in these terms, that the discourse on immigration is becoming less liberal generally. But again, in that kind of paradoxical 70s way, official policy is becoming tougher on immigration, but politics below the surface is beginning to just acknowledge multicultural Britain. So in the mid-70s, a lot of trade unions are beginning to actually have a lot of activists who aren't white. There's a famous strike in Grunwick in North London, which is somewhere where a lot of Asian workers went on strike, mostly women. And Grunwick became a huge confrontation between unions and this factory owner. And all these white trade unionists were turning up day after day after day for months to support these Asian women who were on strike. Now, nowadays, that would be a completely normal thing. But in the 70s, where trade unionism was seen as quite white and male, this is the beginning of a really sort of big change. So I think the 70s compared to now, if it's possible to generalize, Britain was much more racist than it is now. And things were said in the pub, on TV, in public discourse that now would be seen as completely unacceptable. But it's also beginning to reckon with immigration in terms of people who are already here and beginning to open up. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate this. At this point, every MP was white, so politics was shockingly white compared to now. But it's the beginning of a change. And I think it's really important to recognize that. There's a lot of anti-racist work, Rock Against Racism, which was a big movement in the late 70s of kind of punk and reggae bands pushing back against people like the National Front, held these huge concerts in London, 100,000, 200,000 people. So it's the beginning of, if you like, people, liberals or people on the left thinking race is a really important part of our politics. We can't just think about class anymore. We have to think about race. So it's a kind of, depending on your stance around immigration and race in the 70s, Britain's kind of profoundly depressing and also encouraging kind of at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Now, I couldn't quite believe this when I read it, but in 1980, at the end of the 70s, 1/3 of housing was government owned.
Yeah.
So should we maybe talk about Thatcher and what she did to the economy and through policies like the right to buy scheme?
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly important. I mean, the right to buy scheme, in short, was a policy that enabled council tenants to buy their homes at a very large discount. So it might be 50, 60%. And one of the things that's fascinating about it, and I get into this in my book on the 70s, is that in the late 70s, some people in the Labour government were beginning to think about a similar scheme. They were beginning to think more people want to own their own homes. One way we can, if you like, modernise the party is allow council tenants to buy their homes. And Labour councils, who obviously controlled these properties, basically squashed it. So it was, if you like, a lost opportunity for Labour to do it. Instead, the Thatcher government did it. And it was a very clever policy because obviously some people got quite nice properties at a massive discount and then voted Conservative. The downsides of it, which maybe didn't become apparent immediately, was that, first of all, it only benefited kind of wealthier council tenants. And one of the ways in which it was a very Thatcherite policy was that the appeal of it, the way it was sold in TV ads and so on very cleverly, was almost like anyone on an estate. You can live your dream, you can buy your place. But even if it's discounted, you can only buy your property if you've got a decent chunk of money. So generally speaking, the people who were able to buy were wealthier, older people, often on estates that were not in cities. So they wanted to buy houses. They didn't want to buy a flat in a tower block. So if you like, it was a way for the Conservatives to kind of peel off the wealthier, sometimes slightly more small c Conservative council estate tenants and then give them reasons to vote Conservative. And at the beginning of the policy, it seemed to be, absolutely transformational. We now know, looking back on it from now, that in some ways it's a policy that kind of destroyed itself, because the Thatcher government created the right to buy, but then later in the Thatcher government, they basically gave landlords a lot more power. So becoming a landlord became more appealing. You could get rid of tenants at short notice and so on. So a lot of properties that were sold under right to buy have ended up being rented out again, but by private landlords, often to tenants who are on housing benefit. So the government's housing benefit bill now is enormous, and it's partly because in the 60s, those same people would have lived in a cheap council house. The cost to the state would have been quite minimal. The state would have still owned the asset. Now those people might be living in, or their descendants might be living in the same property, paying a vast market rent that the state is having to pay for. So even on its own terms, in some ways, right to buy has kind of failed. It didn't create, it temporarily created a much bigger property owning class, but the peak of property ownership in Britain per capita is, 15 years ago. It's fallen back quite a long way since then. So even if you think property ownership is like very good in itself, arguably the policy in the long term failed. But at the time, it was politically brilliant. And a lot of Labour people who I spoke to for the book were sort of still gnashing their teeth about it, because they said they would have done it slightly differently, but essentially it was their idea and they didn't do it, and the Conservatives did it. So it's one of those big what ifs about the period.
Another big what if about the period, which I see a lot on Instagram at the moment, people kind of realizing and getting a bit upset about it, is Thatcher's policy around North Sea oil and gas.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a completely fascinating aspect of the period. So North Sea oil, just to give a brief outline, was kind of discovered in the late 60s. So all through the 70s, whoever's in government is thinking, if we can be the government that brings North Sea oil ashore, we will get a lot of tax revenue from this, and that will transform the country, essentially. And it comes ashore during the Wilson government. I think it was 75. Lots of ceremonies. Sort of Queen went up to, Aberdeen, they sort of big transparent tube with the oil kind of coming ashore. So it's very exciting for those governments. But the big beneficiary from the revenue from North Sea oil was the Thatcher government, because it didn't start coming ashore in big quantities until the very end of the 70s. So it's a very tantalising thing. And Tony Benn, who was a very left-wing Labour minister in the 70s, was demoted by Wilson, basically for being too left-wing, and made energy minister at the end of the 70s. And Tony Benn, who was very brilliant but not very good at getting on with people in cabinet, came up with this idea at the end of the 70s that Britain should have a sovereign wealth fund, and its revenue from North Sea oil should be put in that fund. And because it was Tony Benn's idea, they said, no, we're not going to do this. And that's essentially exactly what Norway has done, and it's now one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So one of the great what-ifs is, if the revenue had been kept in a sovereign wealth fund, rather than, as Thatcher did, generally spent on things like the massive benefits bill in the 80s when unemployment went up. This is a slightly crude view, but people on the left will say Thatcher essentially squandered North Sea oil. She spent the money on basically tax cuts and paying the unemployed the dole, and instead the money should have been kept, and then we could be like a Scandinavian country sitting on a great sovereign wealth fund. So it is tantalising, and the reality of North Sea oil in the 70s is so interesting as well, because it's a period so associated with industrial decline in Britain, and obviously all over the country factories were closing. But then just offshore, kind of out of sight, Britain essentially created a new industry from scratch. No one had ever drilled for North Sea oil before. It's a very, very difficult sea to drill for oil in, because it's very deep and cold and it's very stormy. So they essentially, in collaboration with Norway particularly, invented a whole set of new technologies, the rigs, the drilling, the drill bits, everything, from scratch. And so it's an astonishing kind of achievement. And at the time, people were kind of proud, but because it was kind of out of sight, you kind of, in a way, it didn't have a kind of political potency that, most people in Britain have never seen an oil rig. When I was writing my book, I went and spent a couple of days on one, because I thought I actually want to go to see what it's like. And it's like being on a kind of massive building site in the middle of a raging sea. It's sort of extraordinary, sort of dripping girders and, ladders. I'm scared of heights. It was absolutely terrifying. Landing in a helicopter, going up and down ladders, massive waves to the horizon, but astonishing sort of technology there still. So it's such an interesting thing, North Sea oil, because in a way it's the opposite of a story of decline in this period. It's like, we found this asset we didn't think we had. It's going to make the country rich, but it's always just out of reach through the 70s. And then the Thatcher government is the government that gets the benefit. But it's a really, really interesting sort of counterfactual. Had Britain used that wealth differently, would Britain have had a different future? Would never have been as rich as Norway, because obviously they're dividing their revenue amongst a much smaller population. But it could have been very handy to have, say in the financial crisis, when the Labour government had to bail out the banks and had a big deficit, and we know what followed from that, austerity. If Britain had a load of money from North Sea oil, there might have been no need to make those cuts. They could have just used that money, but it wasn't there.
Were we living in Margaret Thatcher's world for the next 40 years, and are we still now, or is it changing?
It's a really good question. I think in economic terms, I think in lots of ways we still are. That although the growth record of, if you like, the Thatcher kind of economic strategy is quite mixed. She had big recessions. Britain's economic growth since Thatcher came in has been quite erratic. So she didn't transform the economy in terms of its growth, although she said she would. Its productivity improvements have been very sluggish. So in a way, the miracle that she said she would produce didn't happen. But the mentality about the economy, I think she embedded. So the idea that entrepreneurs are kind of heroic, the idea that government wastes money, the idea that government has to really kind of mind its spending and sort of not upset the markets. You see now in how Rachel Reeves behaves, those ideas are quite embedded. So I would say that economically, I think she did kind of win. Maybe that victory is attenuating now, is becoming a bit threadbare, but certainly for a long period. But I think in other areas, she lost. And I think that's one thing that's fascinating, that her social conservatism, I think, ultimately kind of failed. That obviously there's plenty of people in Britain who are socially conservative now, but all kinds of things she didn't like, like she legislated against the, in inverted commas, promotion of homosexuality in schools, whereas now even really right-wing people are fine with civil partnerships, equal marriage, etc. So in lots of areas to do sort of, men and women working, to do with race and so on, I'd say that a lot of the things that Thatcher wanted were about sort of trying to hold back the future. And Ken Livingstone, who was a prominent sort of thorn in her side in the 80s as the head of the Greater London Council, and was a great promoter of kind of racial equality and so on. In one of his books, he makes a really interesting point. He said that he thought he would always win on these kind of social issues because Thatcher was trying to restore the world of the 50s that she'd grown up in, and that world had just gone, essentially. And I think that there's, Thatcherism in lots of ways. If Thatcher was alive today, I think she wouldn't really like Britain socially, the sort of texture of it. And some of the more thoughtful Thatcherites, I remember interviewing Norman Tebbit, when he was really an old man, but still sharp as a tack. And he said, I feel quite melancholy because I feel like, we won all these battles in the economy and on trade unions, but we kind of lost on all these other issues to do with identity politics, if you like. So I think one of the reasons Britain is such a sort of contradictory society is that it's almost had a sort of, crudely speaking, a sort of right-wing economic revolution and a sort of left-wing social revolution simultaneously. And so we're left with this very sort of complex, even the idea that London, the city we're in now, is a kind of bastion of the left. That's a huge change. In the 80s, the Conservatives dominated a lot of London. So very wealthy people in London who work in the private sector, they might not vote Labour now because Labour are very unpopular, but they might vote Green or Lib Dem. So in all kinds of ways, Britain has developed in ways that Thatcher would have hated, but in the same way, other things that she did will have been embedded. And something I often think about why Britain in some ways I think is quite unhappy is that in some ways, people on the left and the right, both of them won the battle that wasn't their key battle. So if you like, the people on the right, real true conservatives wanted a kind of social conservatism to stay forever, and they lost that battle. Instead, they won the economic battle. And the people on the left really wanted to win the economic battle, but they didn't win that one. They won the social one. And so it's almost like both sides have got the sort of second prize in their view. And so they're, and obviously, that's a very simplified way of looking at it. But I think some of that is kind of in the gut of people on the left and the right. They feel like they got the second prize.
Right. Interesting. So my final question is, which 70s prime minister would you like to be prime minister today?
It's a good question. Is Thatcher's part of it? Is she part of it as well? This is probably a cheat. I would probably say like a slightly younger version of Harold Wilson. I think the Wilson you get in the 70s is slightly tired, slightly winding down. But if we're assuming that Britain is very troubled, somebody with his ability to communicate, who's a brilliant communicator, and also someone who could balance different factions, that was probably what Britain would need now, I would say. Maybe I'm not saying Thatcher because I'm on the left, not the right, but I think he was probably the most able of all those people then. I think Thatcher maybe later in the 80s, when she was in her kind of pomp, was a very commanding figure. But the early Thatcher, I mean, we'll know this, was quite unpopular as Prime Minister, struggled and so on. So, yeah, I think probably Wilson, which is interesting. But I think just the way in which he was able to balance all the different factions and survive the crises. And I think nowadays, especially with Starmer, he's not a good communicator. Wilson's ability to communicate, even though when we watch the videos now, it seems quite old-fashioned, but he had a real rapport, very cheeky. I think that's very important, and he had that. But I don't think any of the prime ministers in the 70s are kind of that inspiring, to be honest.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.